Kia ora koutou. Welcome to eHealthTALK NZ. I'm Rebecca Macbeth. I'm the media editor at HINZ, and today I'm joined by a board member of the Medical Technology Association of New Zealand, Aisling Weir. This episode is part of a collaborative podcast series with MTANZ, which is exploring issues and themes relevant to the medical technology manufacturers, importers and distributors of medical devices in New Zealand. So welcome on the show, Aisling. Lovely to have you join me.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So first of all, can you just tell us a bit about your background of working in the medical device sector?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a commercial lawyer by trade, and I've been specialising in medical technology and also the wider health sector for about 15 years. I started off working at Fisher & Paykel Healthcare quite a long time ago and then spent most of my career in private practice. And it was in that time that I got connected with MTANZ and did their sort of full review of the therapeutic products bill as it was then. And I've now left private practice, but I am now the head of legal and risk for Aroa Biosurgery, which is a medical device manufacturer out in Mangere, Auckland.
Great, you've come full circle then.
Have come full circle.
Yeah. Before we start talking about regulation, can you just take us through exactly what medical devices are?
Often I find that people are very familiar with medicines and what medicines are because they're a normal part of our lives. But medical device is a term that not very many people are familiar with. So, because I'm a lawyer, I will start with the legal definition. And that is that a medical device is any apparatus, instrument, machine, or really thing that has a therapeutic purpose, which means it's used for diagnosing or preventing, monitoring, or treating a disease or a condition in humans. And so far that could apply to medicines too, but the key difference is their mode of action. So medicines work pharmacologically or through the immune system or the metabolic system, and medical devices work in a different way. So I've actually brought some to show you because it's quite a wide range of things. So for example, this is a disposable syringe, which we all are familiar with for, administering Pamol to small children. That's a medical device. This is it's a mask for the delivery of non-invasive ventilation to patients. This is a pulse oximeter, which is different again. Obviously, that involves digital technology. This is, for the people who can't see it, this is an Aroa product. So this is for the treatment of wounds, particularly things like diabetic ulcers. And that's made from sheep forestomach tissue, so really different again. And then this is a COVID test, or more specifically, a rapid antigen test. And that is an example of an IVD, which is an in vitro diagnostic tool, which is also a type of medical device. And then quite apart from these small things that I've brought in, right at the other end of the spectrum are things like MRIs and CAT scans. And I couldn't bring in, my local MRI or CAT scan here today. But so it's an incredibly broad range of devices.
Yeah, well, you've certainly painted a great picture there of the scope that we're talking about. And we know New Zealand has been talking about medical device regulation for more than 2 decades now. So what does make this journey so complex, and why has progress been so slow, do you think?
Well, I think if you ask that question to anybody in the medical device sector, you would probably get slightly different answers because there has been a huge array of different factors which have meant that the process has taken so long. I think from my perspective, the first thing to recognise is that from a regulatory perspective, medical devices are an incredibly, again, diverse range of products. So you can't regulate a syringe and have exactly the same rules regulating a syringe as you do to an MRI. It simply doesn't work. So the regulation itself has to be quite nuanced, and it has to be structured to take into account the kind of risk that each product may present, which again varies quite wildly. The second thing is that the medical device space in particular evolves incredibly fast. So just to kind of illustrate this, the exposure draft of the Therapeutic Products Bill came out in December 2018. And then the first proper draft, something that we could actually review and have some comments and consultation on, didn't come out until the end of 2022. But in the meantime, what we saw was, and you'll know this from your work, an expansion of telehealth and remote patient monitoring technology. We saw medical AI coming to the fore. And the other notable thing is we started to see a much wider range of wearables, particularly wearables with diagnostic or health tools built in. So even in that relatively short period of time, the iteration and the technology itself has developed, quite remarkably. And then you have things like the swings of government decision making in terms of whether natural health products, so things like vitamins and mineral supplements, were going to be included in the one piece of legislation along with medicines and medical devices or not. So there are a few things in there, and a pandemic, that slowed the whole thing down.
So when we are talking about regulating medical devices, are we talking just about devices that are used within the healthcare sector itself, or are we also talking about consumer devices like smartwatches or other things that people might use in their own homes?
Well, potentially we're talking about both. So one of the things that the Therapeutic Products Act did was regulate software as a medical device, or SAMD, as a type of medical device. And what that is it's software used for a therapeutic purpose. So those words I was talking about earlier, diagnosing, monitoring, those kind of purposes, but software that works on its own without being part of a larger physical medical device. So in some cases, that will describe wearables like a smartwatch. And whether those devices are provided in a hospital or a GP practice or in a pharmacy or in an Apple store really makes no difference in terms of the reach of the regulation.
Interesting. So you've talked about the Therapeutic Products Act. So that was brought in to replace New Zealand's Medicines Act, which was no longer fit for purpose, specifically in relation to all these new technologies that we've talked about. Why? What was the issue with that, and what needs updating?
So many things, so many issues. So I think the easiest way to describe it is to look at the title of the Act. So it's the Medicines Act 1981. And as much as I would love to say that I wasn't born in 1981, I was alive then. I was 2. And at that time, if we look back, we were all into Pac-Man computer games, and we were still using mercury thermometers in the hospitals. You fast forward now, we're using technologies like gene therapies, cell and tissue therapies, AI, SAMD. None of those things are covered by the Medicines Act. I think the other thing that I would say, and this is a purely lawyer kind of comment, is that the Medicines Act is really unclear and hard to navigate around. So it is regarded as a very difficult piece of legislation to advise on. It's simply so unclear. And it was actually slated for update way back in the 90s. So that will give you some sense of just how out of date it really is.
So we did have the Therapeutic Products Act actually passed into law in 2023. That was obviously aimed at modernising the regulation, but it was then withdrawn by the current government. What were the problems with that act from your perspective?
Good question. And again, lots of different people would give lots of different answers for this. I think that it was trying to do too many things all at once. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. One, the government had decided that the Act should include natural health products as well as medicines and medical devices. And then there was the decision to add rongoa in there as well, so Māori health practices, which made the Act incredibly broad in terms of its application. And then a decision was made in terms of the design of the Act itself, that there would be a core range of provisions that would apply across those different types of products. And what that meant was there was a lot of unintended, I think, consequences or practical outcomes from that drafting, which is a shame because actually from a technical legal perspective, it was a really elegant solution. It just meant that practically it didn't work very well when you looked at how it was going to apply on the ground. So for example, in some cases, medical devices were treated as though they had the same sorts of risks associated with them as medicines, which was inappropriate in some spaces. Also, the Act required medical device exporters, so people manufacturing and exporting out of New Zealand to, say, Australia or the US, to get market approvals simply to export, which makes very little sense when those products will have to meet the regulatory requirements of the country they're going into. So the US or Australia or Canada, they all have their own requirements. So it felt like there were hurdles put in place there that would really slow down business. I think the other major issue was that the Act didn't really take into account the realities of the medical supply chain into New Zealand. So to put some context around that, New Zealand imports 95% of the medical devices that we use across the health sector, right? We have a very small domestic supply. Add to that the fact that we are a tiny nation at the bottom of the world. And often for big companies, really big manufacturers, we are regarded or treated like another state of Australia. That's the kind of, in the world scheme of things, that is how we play. And so for practical purposes, in order for exporters and distributors to be bringing product into New Zealand, we need to try as hard as we can to ensure that there's no extra cost or extra work or resources required to get products here than, say, Australia or other countries that they're exporting into. And unfortunately, what had happened with the Act was that it did exactly the opposite. And there were a couple of technical reasons for that. But essentially, it would have required manufacturers and distributors to be doing clinical studies, to be filling in forms and paying fees that were over and above what they would have had to do to get into other export countries. And the concern was that that would mean that big companies and other distributors would pull out of New Zealand, and that wouldn't be very good for the patients in New Zealand. It means that they would be only able to access a much more restricted range of medical devices.
MTANZ obviously advocates and lobbies for the medical technology distributors and exporters, as you've been talking about. Do you believe that successive governments have truly tried to listen to and understand this kind of industry advice on medical device regulation? And why is it so important to do that?
Well, what I can say is I think this government has been incredibly engaged with MTANZ and other industry associations on the ground. The therapeutics team at the Ministry of Health has a specialist medical device person, which was great. And also they have been meeting on a very regular basis with industry associations. So they really, truly have been engaging, like top marks to them for that level of engagement.
So MTANZ has its own regulatory principles. How did they translate into practical outcomes for medical device companies operating in New Zealand?
MTANZ has a set of 5 principles which we've come up with that we think will ensure that any piece of regulation of medical devices is risk proportionate and also really takes into account the factors I was talking about earlier in terms of how the New Zealand medical device supply really works. The first one of those is that we would like to see international best standards incorporated into the Act, so we are keeping up really with the rest of the world. Secondly, we'd like to see third-party assessments being used. Now, that's a bit of medical device jargon, but what it really means is that we want the regulator in New Zealand to be able to rely on trusted third parties who are overseas and their assessments of the product's safety and efficiency, so that our regulator doesn't have to do all the assessments from scratch. The third thing we'd like to see is a fair fee structure. So we'd like to see reasonable fees imposed because, as you know, this is a whole new set of regulations and comes with its own costs. And we would like to see those fees really take into account the small market size in New Zealand. Fourthly, we think it is imperative that there's a major focus in the regulation on vigilance and surveillance of products once they've entered into the market, so when they're being used on patients. And that is to ensure that any safety concerns and issues are recognised and dealt with quickly, and that's all about, obviously, patient safety. And finally, we would like to see the regulation really support innovation and exporters from New Zealand to be able to use New Zealand as a base and to get their products into overseas countries.
So we do now have a new medical products bill that's due to be entered into Parliament in June 2026, with draft legislation due by the end of this year. So has MTANZ had a good level of engagement and input into the new legislation? And are you hopeful that this bill will resolve the many issues you've outlined with the current regulation?
Absolutely. There's a high level of optimism within MTANZ about the new bill, and there are several reasons for that. One, the therapeutics team at the ministry have engaged with every point of contention that MTANZ raised with regard to the Therapeutic Products Act and have accepted all or almost all of MTANZ's policy settings that MTANZ would like to see incorporated into the bill. So to give an example of that, two key things are different this time round. One, the piece of legislation is not covering natural health products. It's only covering medicines and medical devices, so that will simplify things enormously. And secondly, medicines and medical devices will be treated very separately. There'll be separate chapters within the legislation about each of them. So we're hoping that that will avoid the issues that we saw with the Therapeutic Products Act, where medical devices were sort of slightly lumped with medicines and treated in some of the same ways that medicines were. So I've got to say, we are very optimistic.
Great. And you spoke earlier about software as a medical device. I understand there's also a distinction between software in a medical device. And I know that AI is a bit of a passion topic for you as well, and things are developing rapidly in this space. Do you think these technology considerations are going to be adequately covered in the new bill?
I think it's too early to say. So all that we know sort of for sure right now is that the new bill will cover software as a medical device. And just so people understand the sort of distinction that you were talking about earlier, I'm putting on the pulse ox on my finger, and that's got software in it. So that's software in a medical device. Software as a medical device, a really easy example of that would be an app that helps to interpret MRI scans. So that app is completely separate from the medical device itself that's doing the MRIs. So that's software as a medical device. And you're 100% correct. We're increasingly seeing AI technologies embedded into software as a medical device. So what we know for sure is that the Act will regulate SAMD and AI. And that's about all we know at this stage. That's all that the government has announced in terms of the documents that they have released to the public. I'm really excited about developments in this space. I think from a patient safety perspective, it's going to be essential going forward that medical AI is regulated, particularly those pieces that could have real harm to patients if they diagnose in an incorrect way or treat in an incorrect way. I think it's hugely complicated though. It's not an easy piece of work to do and to really understand the technology and regulate it appropriately. So I think that's going to be the big question. But the fact that the TGA has been wrestling with this and the FDA also and have made some really good strides in this space, my hope is that the therapeutics team can look to what's happened overseas and make some really good calls about what that means and sort of best practice to put into place in New Zealand.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens because, like you were speaking about, the ongoing monitoring of how the devices are operating in New Zealand is so important. And when you've got something like AI, which is changing all the time and potentially can be a black box as well, in terms of we don't entirely understand how it's actually making decisions or coming to certain conclusions. I mean, how could you possibly monitor something like that?
Both the TGA and the FDA have, as I said, tried to wrangle with this and really try to put an end to the extent that you can to that black box phenomena that happens with AI. So, for example, in the TGA, if you're an AI developer and you've got some software that does have a therapeutic purpose, you have to have it registered with the TGA. And the TGA asks you questions like, show me the clinical data that attests to this piece of software being safe and efficient. And we'll ask questions like, what was the patient cohort that this clinical data is based on? Did that cohort include Aborigine and Torres Strait Islanders? So there's a real look at, has this been trained on the right kind of appropriate data for our population, which I think New Zealand could really riff off that essentially. And I think, the FDA has also tried to tackle this question of how do you regulate something that is made to change? It's all very well, and I'm picking up the pulse ox, to regulate something like this, which doesn't inherently, in terms of its innards, change all the time. But as we know, AI is a different kettle of fish. And one of the things that they have done, and I'm not going to be able to talk to this in huge levels of detail, but they are asking people to say, what are the bounds of the changing and the developing that will happen within this AI? And how will you know, developer, that this AI is changing and learning in a way that goes outside those bounds? So conceptually, they're having to really wrangle with, how do we regulate safely something that is in a constant state of development? But again, I think, some of this thinking is being done really well in other jurisdictions. And my hope is that we can look to those jurisdictions for doing all the hard thinking and try and, use the best of what they've come up with for New Zealand.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Aisling. What a insightful discussion. I hope that all the listeners have enjoyed it as well. And to those listening, be sure to tune in for future episodes in collaboration with MTANZ, and please like and subscribe to this webcast to make it easier for others to find. Mā te wā.